Good morning, everyone. I'd like to cordially invite you to this year's 2021 Memorial Day ceremony for the City of Holyoke, virtual. At this time, please join us in the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the brave and the home of the
At this time, I now welcome Acting Mayor Terrence Murphy for his remarks.
First of all, let me start off by thanking our veterans, all of our veterans and their families, for the sacrifices that they made, for the contributions that they've made to our country and our society, for their willingness to stand up for principles that they believe in, and in many cases, unfortunately, have given the ultimate sacrifice. And Memorial Day, we should certainly recognize all who have ever given the ultimate sacrifice in defense of the principles that they believe in this country. As far as today's living veterans and their families, we should make sure that we offer whatever support we can. We should make sure that we're in a position to reach out to them whenever necessary. And I will say our Veteran Services does just that. And I commend all of them for what they've done. I've several times have asked them to come out and meet with the veteran on the street, and they don't delay. They come out and they've made a difference. So that is the kind of thing we need to do. But ultimately, we'd like to be in a position where we don't have to have veterans coming back with combat injuries that are demoralizing, or have PTSD or other things like that, or have to be away from their family so long. I mean, ultimately, we need to have the security and the military strength, if you will, but also the principles so that we can influence the world affairs without necessarily having to get involved in military conflicts. To be strong enough so that people are saying we do not want to fight the United States, but also to do it with compassion for those other countries, with empathy for those other countries. So it's a combination. But the biggest blessing we could provide would be to never have to send somebody into a military conflict again. I mean, if we ever could do that, and obviously that's ideal, but that we should strive for that ideal. I know we're not going to attain it, but that's what we should be looking for. And it is not easy. But again, for all the veterans who have made the sacrifice, for all the families who have given their time, who've had to be away from their loved ones, who've had to come and help their loved ones after combat injuries, all we can say is thank you. If you need us, please ask. We want to be there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At this time, I would also like to welcome our state representative, Patricia Duffy.
I'm so pleased to be here with you all, honoring those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms, but also in so doing, in honoring those of you, active service and veterans, who stood right next to them and were also willing to make that sacrifice. Those freedoms that we have, it can be anything from enjoying your day-to-day life, supporting your loved ones. And for me, you all took an oath. You afforded me the freedom to take an oath as well, to protect and defend the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is one of the oldest living democratic documents on this planet. So it's an incredible honor. This is a bittersweet Memorial Day for us here in Holyoke. It's the second Memorial Day since the COVID-19 outbreak at the Soldiers' Home. This year, it's true that those heroes did not get the care and protection that they deserved. This year, we know now that their legacy will be honored with a facility that all those heroes deserve, that all of you deserve. So I thank you again for inviting me here, and I'm really looking forward to the time soon when we can really be standing shoulder to shoulder, but we're still shoulder to shoulder now. Thank you.
Madam Representative, thank you so much for your remarks. At this time, it is my distinct privilege and honor to welcome our keynote speaker, which is Lieutenant Colonel Retired Margaret Peggy Bowe, U.S. Army, retired. Brief introduction on Lieutenant Colonel Bowe. She hails from Holyoke, Massachusetts, graduated from Emerson College, and retired from the United States Army in 1996. At this time, Lieutenant Colonel Peggy Bowe.
Good morning, and welcome to all of you who are joining us for this virtual Holyoke Memorial Day ceremony. I'd like to acknowledge the elected officials that are with us today: State Representative Patricia Duffy, Acting Mayor Terry Murphy, and City Council President Todd McGee. I would especially like to thank the United Veterans of Holyoke for asking me to be this year's keynote speaker. As a young girl growing up here in Holyoke, I certainly never pictured myself in this role. But then again, there are a lot of things that have transpired, both in my life and in the world, that I never could have imagined. I hesitated to accept this invitation, but I decided it would provide a lasting record in my own voice for my grandson and any future grandchildren I might be blessed with. I also think it's important for my students and former students to hear my truth in my own words. I've spent much of the last 20 years as a teacher in local schools, and prior to that I taught for the Army. So if I become a little pedantic, please forgive me. My remarks are going to fall into 3 sections. I'll start with some traditional Memorial Day remarks before I tell you a bit about the history of women in the military, and then I'll finish with how I became one of those women and a few of my experiences as such. Memorial Day, as we now know it, started out as Decoration Day shortly after the Civil War. It was a time for families and organizations to decorate the graves of the dead from that war. In fact, the tradition of Memorial Day picnics started because in spring, families would pack a picnic lunch and eat at the cemetery as they decorated the graves of their deceased loved ones. By the end of the 19th century, ceremonies were consistently being held on the 30th of May throughout the country, but it wasn't until after World War I that Decoration Day officially began honoring all veterans who had lost their lives in all previous American wars. Finally, in 1971, the federal government declared Memorial Day a national holiday to be celebrated on the last Monday of May, which brings us to today. No one in those early years would have envisioned virtual celebrations like we've had these last 2 years due to a global pandemic. But then a lot of things have changed. Now, anyone who knows me will tell you that I am a woman of very strong opinions. And one of the things guaranteed to get a reaction out of me is when people say, "Happy Memorial Day." While it is important to commemorate this day, It's not a happy holiday. Our society has turned Monday holidays into little more than an excuse for car and appliance sales. And while I'm all for boosting the economy, let's try not to forget the real reason for this day. The only thing likely to get a stronger reaction out of me is people who call Patriots' Day Marathon Monday. But that's a topic for another day. To conclude this part of my remarks, I want to acknowledge all those who have given their lives in service to this wonderful country, but most especially to my contemporaries who served and died in Vietnam. Welcome home, my brothers. As far back as the American Revolution, a few brave women have served in the military, but never officially. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts disguised herself as a man so she could join the fighting. And Margaret Corbin of New York, better known as Molly Pitcher, took up her husband's position firing a cannon in the Battle of Washington Heights after he had lost his life. There's even a monument to Margaret Corbin at West Point in New York. Women were first officially allowed into the military as nurses and other medical professionals in the 1900s. Their role was very specific and limited to the medical field. Now, I've known a large number of Army nurses over the years, and while I respect them tremendously, most, granted not all, but most would list themselves as nurses first, and soldiers somewhere further down their list of self-descriptors. That said, the only female names on the Vietnam Memorial Wall in D.C. are those of nurses. Non-medical women were first recruited during World War I, when a small number of women were enlisted into the Signal Corps to be telephone operators. Although they wore uniforms, were subject to military rules and regulations, and could earn awards the same as the male soldiers, they were still considered civilian employees. After the war, these units were disbanded, and the experiment was over. It took until 1978 for these women to finally be recognized as veterans. But in the spring of 1942, with the threat of World War II looming, auxiliary corps were established for all the major military services. The concept was to enlist women into critical, non-combat roles in the Army, the Navy, and even the Marines, in order to free a man to fight. Women were expressly prevented from participating in anything related to combat and were not considered a formal part of the military services, as the term auxiliary implies. But a short 14 months later, the auxiliary was dropped from their designation, and the Women's Army Corps became part of the regular Army, as did the other services. The jobs for women were extremely limited, mostly to clerical, logistical, and dietary fields, and always in rear areas. Women did remain in the service after World War II, but in relatively small numbers. Now, let me fast forward about 30 years, to the spring of 1972 to be specific. I was a senior at Emerson College in Boston. The anti-war movement was strong in Boston and definitely at Emerson. My college roommate Barbara, who was a year behind me, was stressing about how to pay for her senior year since she had just been notified that most, if not all, federal financial aid was being cut. But she soon found out about a unique program the Army had called the College Junior Program. It recruited college women to spend a month at Fort McClellan during the summer between their junior and senior years. If they did well, and they were accepted, they would be paid a monthly stipend during their senior year and be commissioned as second lieutenants when they graduated. And they would only be required to serve 2 years beyond that. Remember, at this point in time, women were excluded from ROTC and the military academies. Most female officers in the Army were direct commissioned, and a few came up through OCS. The CJ program, as it was called, had become a prime source for young WAC lieutenants. I was skeptical, and it didn't apply to me, but I agreed to accompany Barbara for moral support when she went to meet the WAC selection officer, but mostly I intended to play the devil's advocate. On the appointed day, we were picked up a few blocks from campus because we didn't want to be seen getting into an Army sedan. We spent the day being tested and interviewed by a number of Army officers and recruiters. At the end of the day, Captain Meng, yes, I remember her name 49 years later, handed us both a packet of paperwork to fill out. I started to refuse the packet, saying I'd only been there to keep Barbara company. But Captain Ming looked me straight in the eye and said, while she would be glad to process Barbara for the CJ program, I was the one she wanted to recruit as an officer. She said she saw real leadership in me. I was stunned. And to avoid being rude, I took the packet. But back in the dorm, I put the packet in my bottom drawer, and I never intended to look at it again. Barbara got to work on her packet immediately. Her dad had worked for the FAA maintaining air traffic control equipment on military installations all over the world, so they'd lived in a lot of places, making the paperwork for her rather difficult. On her 4th or 5th day, as she was tearing her hair out, she challenged me to fill it out so we could compare if it was easier for someone who had basically lived in the same place their whole life. The short answer is it was easier, but it wasn't easy. Instead of taking 8 to 10 days, it only took me 4 or 5 and about a half a dozen phone calls home to get information from my parents. After that time investment, and after confirming with Captain Meng that I was under no obligation to join, even if I submitted the paperwork, I mailed it in. I figured it was a good safety net. Fast forward another 6 months. I'm living at home with my parents, and I still haven't found a real job. The phone rang one evening and Mom answered, and the person on the other end asked to speak to Lieutenant Bowe. I'd been selected. On November 12, 1972, I raised my right hand and was sworn in as a second lieutenant. I had no idea what I was doing. But even though my parents had never served, in hindsight, since 4 of my parents' 6 siblings had been in the military, including my Aunt Claire, it was in my DNA. As I was getting ready to report to Fort McClellan, Alabama in January of 1973, the rules regarding women in the military were all changing. WAC expansion, as it was called, was to be part of the all-volunteer Army that was replacing the draft. I was one of 80 women from across the country who were to be the first class of a new course called the Women's Officer Orientation Course, WOOC for short, where we would supposedly learn what the male lieutenants had learned in ROTC. We were to be the first women sent to the previously all-male branch basic courses. We had the option to be assigned to any of the combat support or combat service support branches. In other words, anything other than infantry, armor, artillery, or air defense artillery. I was one of the 7 women detailed to the Signal Corps. The law prevented us from being commissioned anything but WAC, Nurse, or Medical Services Corps, but we could be detailed to the other branches, and that was nearly the same thing. I attended the Signal Officer Basic course at Fort Gordon in the spring of 1973. Our class was approximately 1/3 female and 2/3 male. Our male classmates were often asked what it was like to train with the women. The classic answer became, it was normal. They didn't know what it was like to train without us. In other words, we had carried our weight. From there, I was assigned to the 1st Signal Brigade in Korea, where I was the first female to arrive in country wearing something other than WAC or nurse brass. This set a pattern for the rest of my career. I was the first, or one of the first, in almost every assignment during my entire career. I often joked I have to be careful how I comb my hair because I have to cover the scars from all the glass ceilings I've broken. The WAC Corps was officially disbanded in 1978, and I had a respectable, if somewhat unremarkable, career. After my 2 years of active duty, I immediately joined the reserves where, yes, I was the first female officer in the Basic Training Brigade located in Connecticut. This assignment allowed me the opportunity to work with the first co-ed basic training company at Fort Dix. They were headed to be the first co-ed class at the West Point Prep School. That was followed by assignments in technical intelligence and psychological operations, and then I was selected to be an instructor at the Army Reserve School in Denver, where I taught the Officers Advanced Course to a class of students primarily from the Army Reserve Hospital at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center. There had been issues in the past with these classes because some of the medical personnel claimed that they couldn't understand the tactical material because they were female, an excuse that obviously didn't work if I was the instructor. I did discover I had a gift for explaining some of the things in a different way so that it made sense to the non-tactically trained medical officers, which worked in my favor. In that assignment, I would spend my annual trainings in the summer back at Fort Gordon teaching the Signal Officers Advanced course where, you guessed it, I was the first female to do so. I was also asked to train in electronic warfare so that I could teach that specialty there. EW was one of the most fascinating fields I had the privileges of studying or teaching in my career. During my career, and especially during my years as an instructor, I was often asked, do you think there'll ever be women in combat or women in the combat arms? Along the way, prohibitions against women had been lifted for air defense artillery and the aviation branch when it was founded. The first Gulf War in the 90s answered the first part of the question because there were no longer safe zones or rear areas because women had become integrated into the service support mission. And in the last few years, those other restrictions against women in the combat arms have been lifted. We now have women in special operations and with ranger tabs. I've always said that it should be determined, that assignments should be determined by the individual's physical and mental abilities and not by their gender. So in the 48 and a half years since I was commissioned, women have taken their rightful place next to the men in defending our country. I'm proud of the small contribution I've made in breaking the glass ceilings for other women to pass through. But with equality comes hardships, and many women have since paid the ultimate price, and we must remember them equally today. At the Military Women's Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, there's a special recognition wall for those women. That memorial recently updated its name. It was formerly called the Women in Service to America Memorial, and it's located near the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. Before I close, I would be remiss if I didn't say, if you know a woman who has served in the military at any time, please make sure she's registered at the memorial. Each of us who are registered is tasked to tell at least 3 women a year to register. Hopefully, at least 3 women will hear me today and register. It's very easy to do on the memorial's website, and it's free. So please register. Our story is important. And with that, I will close. I have a lot more stories, but those will have to be shared at another time. Perhaps some morning at Mrs. Mitchell's kitchen, where Chris Sims of the United Veterans first met me. I truly and humbly thank you for allowing me to speak today. May God bless America and all my brothers and sisters on duty around the world.